everybody here to the January 23rd Freedom Hub Working Group. I appreciate everybody being here. It's going to be a very interesting topic once again today. And on that note, I'm going to also let Charles do a little rundown on who we've got talking, and then also a little rundown on what's coming up. And I would tell you to start with what's coming up, because I see some people coming on, so we'll fill that time with you talking about the future event.
For sure, Jeff, and thanks. This is Charlie Fromm, and I work with Jeff in health disruption, as well as this weekly webinar for Big Ideas. And the purpose of it is to think of every important policy that can expand our right to pursue happiness, because every opportunity affects our health, and we want to talk about it. So we do have a big event today on licensing privatization, but as Jeff said, let me preview upcoming events. Next Wednesday, we're going to have a great bigger thoughts discussion from David Beto, an Auburn professor, who, if anybody who has invested in the welfare debate should know, he's the author of the mutual aid book. In other words, how do we provide for the poor 100 years ago, or in fact for everyone? Because mutual aid is how we got health care 100 years ago. So tune in next week for David Beto, and then for the Wednesdays in February, we're going to have my dear libertarian friend, Judge Jim Gray, start things off. He is a alternative dispute resolution judge, and so he can talk about the private legal system. And as we just discuss Ubering or disrupting every market, we can't exempt the legal market. So he'll talk about overcriminalization and all issues in that area. Then on the 13th, we'll return to education, which we discussed vigorously a couple weeks ago with the alternative education guy, Jerry Mintz. That was a fantastic webinar for anyone who made that. Kerry McDonald from the Foundation of Economic Education will brief us on more economic innovations, education innovations, excuse me. Then on the 20th, we have an old counsel for Speaker Newt Gingrich, Roman Buehler, on his Article 5 effort to amend the Constitution to require expensive regulations to go through an additional congressional passage effort that could really gum up the works in a good way. So he really knows the regulations, and that's a broad topic, so that'll bring in a lot of different experts. On the final Wednesday, we have Joel Salatin on local food freedom. He's an icon in the local farm freedom movement, so those involved in that issue will really like that one. In March, we have Becky Akers on the Transportation Security Administration, TSA. Everyone hates TSA. We do here too, so we're excited about that one. Jacob Hornberger from the Future Freedom Foundation will come on then the next week. Chris Fryman, who's got a great book on the failure of philosophers to understand the important economic issues. And Jeff Tucker, a well-known libertarian leader, will finish at March. So I'll stop it there, Jeff, and real quick, I can introduce Byron if you like.
If you will, please go to continue.
So over the past few years, I've been an insider with Governor Gary Johnson and the whole libertarian thing. We started off Republican, of course, back in 2011. But we went down the rabbit hole and did the LP thing. But I was running his C4, Our America Initiative, and we were trying to, like AFP, coalesce with all kinds of issues. And one issue I really got into was this thing called licensing privatization. I like big issues. The problem with the licensing issue, and Byron and Murray can discuss this, is it goes after low-hanging fruit because it's so hard to repeal licensing. There are incumbents in every market you can think of who love their licensing, and they just won't give it up. And we'll get to the harder ones like medical and legal, of course. But Byron's proposal that he'll discuss started out when he was at Goldwater and made it into the bill form. And basically, if you're certified with a registered organization, you can escape licensing. There is so much upside to that idea, I can't stand it. It's one of those huge issues. So I'm excited to hear Byron talk about that. He now is at his own think tank in Oklahoma, 1889 Institute. One of my favorite delegates here in Virginia, Nick Freitas, just texted me that he can't join the call, but he has spoken with Byron. He loves this idea. He has some licensing reforms going on right now in Virginia. Lee McGrath is on the call from the Institute for Justice. They've been very aggressive on this issue. And so, Byron, take it away, Jeff. I'm so excited. So thanks so much.
That's great. Thanks. Go ahead. Go ahead, Byron, please.
Okay, great. First of all, I first started thinking about licensing back in the 80s, really, when I was an undergrad and then graduate student, which hence way too much at my age. But and it was in graduate school that I kind of came up with this conceptually. I never had a chance to really do anything with it until I was at the Goldwater Institute. The basic idea is this: licensing at some level has some value, right? For consumers, they at least know that somebody's had a modicum of training. For producers, those who are licensed, the license itself is a signal of quality. We all know that it's not the best signal of quality in the world, but that's the part of the value to them of licensing, besides the fact that it has all these other evil effects that keep competition to a minimum. But I got to thinking, obviously the arguments that are used to preserve licensing are the positive things about licensing, the signaling, the sort of qualitative issues involved. And so for me, the idea was, how can we come up with a system that relieves us of the heavy hand of government that accomplishes the good stuff that licensing is at least supposed to yield for us in the market, which is really all about information, and it's about information about quality. And that's where this private certification idea came from. And obviously there are organizations that certify people as qualified to do all kinds of things. In the tech industry, oh my goodness, it is just rife. If you began to look at job postings from tech companies, they want certified technician in this, certified technician in that. I mean, clearly there are training resources out there granting these credentials, and none of them are granted through any kind of a government agency. But we still have all of these licensed professions that are, I think it's up to about a quarter of the workforce that's covered under licensing. So how do we begin to push that back? And as was mentioned earlier, it's almost impossible to get a license repealed. What we need is a way to flank the system, to go around it, not to constantly try to confront it. There are a lot of schemes, of course, to maybe create a fertile litigation environment or something like that. But there again, there's a lot of risk involved in that strategy. So the idea here is that if you're a private organization and you choose to participate in this regime or institutional arrangement, then you can register with the state. There are certain requirements that you are going to have to accept. There are, you're required, for someone to be certified under you, it has to be a legitimate thing where the requirements to be certified have something to do with the profession that you're certifying. You have to actually actively verify people's qualifications, which any reputable organization certifying people to do a certain task would do anyway. And you have to make sure that your membership lets people know that they're not regulated by the government by requiring them post a sign. You also have to be very transparent. You have to post your scope of practice and how you do, your basic training requirements and who it is that you've certified. You have to list those people. And those people also have to agree be very transparent with, if anybody asks for it, literature about how they've been qualified. And in exchange for this is the important thing. In exchange for this kind of sort of regulation to be considered a participating private certifier, you get, if someone violates your credential, if someone lies that they have your credential in some way, maybe they post a plaque or a diploma or whatever, you get to turn them in for fraud. Under right now, if you're a private certifier and someone violates your credential in that way, makes a false claim about that they have it, in order to protect your integrity as a certifying organization and to protect the integrity of all the people you've certified in the past, you have to sue them, which can be very costly. But that is actually committing fraud. And it really is and should be a crime. And so what this does is, it's not really unlike the government granting limited liability in exchange for some of the regulation that they put on corporations, whether you agree that it's too much or not, which I do. But that's sort of the trade-off, right? You get some of this regulation, you have to be transparent, you have to report your finances, and in exchange for that, you get limited liability. And this is a similar thing. There are certain things that you have to reveal. You're required to reveal them. If somehow or another it turns out that you haven't been following these regulations, or I guess you'd call them regulation, these requirements, then that would be actually a positive defense on the part of someone who might have committed fraud against you. But the point is, in exchange for that, you get this fraud protection. So it's actually quite worthwhile in pursuing. The other aspect of this model bill is that if you set up private certification, and even if your scope of practice overlaps a licensed profession, your certified members, if you will, those who are certified under you, cannot be prosecuted for practicing the profession without a license. So let's say somebody comes up with a whole new area. We might have called it naturopathy at one time. Maybe somebody comes up with something completely new like that. Instead of having to be licensed to keep from being harassed by the medical licensing field, you can simply create a private certification organization. And even though arguably that scope of practice, the health arts, overlaps with these licensed professions, you stand immune to harassment from those agencies. You have a positive immediate defense. If one of your people are harassed by them, all they have to do is pull out the fact that they're privately certified and they can't be messed with. And so this is a way of creating a system where, we basically plank licensing. We create a parallel system that people hopefully would get used to over time, and then hopefully that would lead to, and I mean, there's a lot of hope here, but it seems like a better strategy overall than just trying to butt heads with these people, which rarely works. And just to let you know a little bit of the history of this, I put together a draft of this very basic idea together at Goldwater, and it was Lee McGrath who at IJ who really tuned it up and crossed the T's and dotted the I's legally. And so I want to give him some credit that he doesn't get in the publication, because he told me it was too complicated at IJ to be a co-author. But anyway, this can be applied to a number of different areas. And very often when I present this idea, people say, well, what about law? Why don't we do something that exempts this out of law or medicine? And one of my biggest issues is that medicine is where the problem is. That's where licensing came back at the beginning of the 20th century in the United States in a big way. And that's where you have a huge number of sub-professions being licensed, because the scope of practice for a medical doctor is so broad that you can't do pretty much anything when it comes to the healing arts without encroaching on their scope of practice and them harassing someone. And when it comes to the concerns that people have about medicine, I point out the fact that right now, what determines who can do surgery in a hospital is actually private certification. It's called board certification and insurance liability requirement. It's not the government. As far as the government is concerned, as soon as you graduate from a medical school, you're free to do surgery of any kind whatsoever, anywhere. And obviously, that's not what actually happened. And then the other issue is this bill, this model explicitly says that it's not in any way attempting to encroach on the government's ability to regulate substances when they decide that they're dangerous. And so prescription laws and the requirements to be a licensed medical doctor or nurse practitioner or whatever, those would still exist. It would take decades for that to start breaking down under a regime like this, if it did at all. So the issues about public health and protecting people in the legal area, they're really fundamentally unfounded. The courts would still have the ability to determine who practices before them. This might just open it up to somebody creating a private certification program in will preparation. I don't know, but the whole point is that this is open and flexible, and the market would determine what kinds of professions would be privately certified under a system like this. And now I guess I'm open to questions. That's the basic idea.
Byron, what's happened so far since you've kind of undertaken this task? Has anything started to happen legislatively, any local or states, or any kind of someone trying to pick up the ball and run with it a little bit?
Well, I know that there's the interest, honestly, has been kind of limited, probably as much or more because the message has been limited. This paper was published relatively recently, co-published with Goldwater, it's just an issue of limited coverage. And part of the reason I wrote the paper, I'd referred to the idea and even had model language as an appendix in other papers, was that I think oftentimes people look at the draft bill and get a little lost in it, even though it's not highly complicated or terribly long. But there is a tendency for everybody to get a little lost in the forest. You lose the forest for the trees. And this is just trying to explain, okay, this is why this is here, and break it down for people. There was actually some interest from an Oklahoma state senator. I haven't had a chance to follow up and see if he's actually filed anything, but they actually asked for the model language. There seemed to be some interest in actually filing a bill. So I'm hoping that happens. I'm not sure, but obviously I've got a little bit of a crack there with somebody, and I'm definitely going to exploit it. If they don't do something this year, hopefully they will next year.
It certainly gives you that lead to pursue and get the kind of your language and messaging down. Dr. Feldstein, I was going to say, did you have a little bit of a comment here before anybody else might throw some questions?
Yeah, and I was really happy when Byron asked me to just add a little addendum at the end. This is clearly his work, and his idea. The interesting thing is, without even knowing about it, Shirley Sforney, I don't know if people know Shirley Sforney. She was actually on a teleconference at Cato yesterday with the folks from Virginia on their telemedicine bill that's pending, and I'm involved in a peripheral way in terms of writing an op-ed, and Goldwater's kind of interested in that too. Shirley and I presented a very similar idea to this at, of all places, the CLEAR conference. And I don't know if people know what CLEAR is. It's definitely not a free market or a libertarian organization in any sense of the word. It's actually people working in the belly of the beast. CLEAR stands for, let's see, Commission or Conference on Licensure, Enforcement, and Regulation. And its acronym is CLEAR. And these are people who are professionals in licensure. They work at different states. They work in the federal government. They're accreditation experts, and they are definitely not libertarians. But the interesting thing, and I think to take note, is because these people work in it day by day, they know what's wrong with the current system. And these are good people. These are people who are coming in, punching a clock, getting paid to try to do a job to protect the public. And they have been able to read. They're intelligent. They know that licensure has problems, and it has problems with competition. So they may introduce a bill into what state or another to say increase the scope of practice for a nurse practitioner, only to have it bottled up in a committee by one or two important committee chairmen who are say doctors or dentists or whatever, and it dies. And these people a lot of times have a little bit of a leftward swing. They're interested in seeing people left behind and minorities and neglected groups get a little more empowered. And they see that occupational licensure is not letting that happen. So Shirley Sforney has been writing about licensure for, I don't know, umpteen years. And my interest in licensure started even a little bit earlier than Byron's, because I got licensed to practice medicine in 1970. And I've practiced in many different places and locations and in kinds of environments. And when I was in the 80s, I was elected to a political office. And for two terms, I was reelected. I saw what it was like to be on the other side of the public. And so I kind of have I think kind of realistically on this. And there's no political movement to get this thing started. That's the problem that Byron is facing. That's the problem we're all facing. But I'm very optimistic. And I'm optimistic for the following reason. I don't think it's licensure itself that's the problem, believe it or not. As I mold this over, we don't mind passing a driver's license. And we're kind of happy that the government requires airline pilots take a prescribed course of instruction and practical examinations before they're certified to fly an airplane. So it's not the licensure itself that's disgusting. It's what I call the politicization of licensure. And in fact, I'm finishing up now. I'm working with Nancy Lopez Bauman at the Goldwater, and I have a 10,000 page paper that's going to be published somewhere soon. The Goldwater is going to peddle it. And I've worked in the trenches, both in medicine, as members of the medical association, as president of the county medical association, as president of my state urological association, as a politician, and now as a policy wonk. I think I have a good idea how this is going to get done, because all we need to do is to depoliticize it. And Byron's work is taking it one step in that direction. For example, and it's already been done, by the way. Think about this, and it's what I call the Uberization of licensure. It cost $1.5 million to buy a taxi medallion in Manhattan as of 2013. Today, they're worth less than 1/10 of that. And you know the reason why. Because innovation occurred that made licensing of taxis moot. And even more than anything we do, I think intellectually or in a planned way, I think that's going to happen to medicine. And I think it's going to happen with the Uberization being telemedicine, which is why I think this Virginia bill is so important. So the first thing is, I think they're going to have to come to the realization that the world is moving ahead of this medieval idea of the guild, and I think it's going to outdate itself, and we just have to be ready to let it happen. Second thing is, I think that if we think about how Byron's bill can be used, even if it weren't introduced separately, how you could reform licensure by taking the politician out of it, by letting somebody pass a license, and if he passes a period of instruction and supervised instruction, a written test, and a period of supervised training, like an internship or a residency, or your flight examinations if you're an airline pilot, or your driving test if you're a driver, then you get a better idea. You don't need to have the legislature vote on whether you get a driver's license if you do all that. And I think we're going to head in that direction in medicine as well. So I do have a couple of questions for Byron that Shirley Sporney has asked me to ask him. And again, Shirley is against licensure altogether. The two of us have presented this paper at the CLEAR conference in Denver 2 years ago, where we proposed something very similar to Byron's. We called it Track 2, where people could get certified, the certifying organizations. And by the way, there's a way to get these certifying organizations accepted by the state. And we could elaborate on that, but there's already certifying organizations, lists of certifying organizations that the state accepts, and there's organizations that certify certifying organizations that the state might accept, so that they can outsource and they do this already. They have lists like the American Board of Nursing, and the American Board of Nursing is one of the organizations that the Institute for Certifying Excellence certifies. So there's ways of getting this done, and you could mimic what England does, which is it doesn't have licensing per se. It has trademark registration, which is the license, and that's exactly what Byron is proposing. But Shirley had some questions about this, Byron, and I felt that I tried to answer them as best I could, but she was concerned by a couple things, and so I'm going to let you try to answer these. On page 4 of your proposal, you say somebody's phone is ringing.
Let me see if I can cut that out of there in the background. Continue. I'm searching for where that's coming from.
How you doing? Oh, there's food in the other room for you. Looks actually on.
Got it.
Everyone, Jeff.
Got it. Go ahead.
So are participating, Byron, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
So you have on page 4, you say a participating private certifying organization shall verify and individuals' qualifications before certification and periodically verify that the certified individual remains eligible for certification. I understand what you're saying, and I agree with it. But Shirley, who's against licensure altogether, said, isn't that even worse than what we do today? Aren't there a lot of issues related to periodic verification? And maintenance of certification is a racket in some places. The internists are all over the place, madder than hell at the American College of Physicians and their recertification procedures. How do you answer that?
Well, I think the answer is it's very open-ended. It's not saying you'll re-verify every year or that you have continuing education programs or some number of hours every year. It may be a periodic thing where you're checking to make sure that people are alive and that they're active. That's left up to the private certifying organization. There's nothing there that authorizes. In this case, this was drafted as if the Secretary of State were enforcing it. It could be any agency. It might vary from state to state. But basically, the private certifying organization is registering with the Secretary of State, and they have that agency has the ability to check up on whether or not the private certifying organization is doing some of these practices on a regular basis, or they can take a more hands-off approach. It would depend on that state and who's actively pursuing it. But one of the things to keep in mind that whenever I am not one of these people that is constantly compromising with himself, but at the same time, there are a few things that you throw into a model bill that you're thinking, if I don't answer this question, this doesn't even have a chance. And one of the issues that comes up is, well, are these licensing organizations check up on their members some? Shouldn't they be checking up on their members? And this is just very open-ended. It's not saying that it has to be all that rigorous, if you will.
So the way I answered it to Shirley, because quite frankly, there's going to be a lot. I'm sorry. May I talk? Is it all right?
You're fine. Go ahead.
Yeah.
One of the ways I answered it to Shirley was this. Right now, the internists in the American College of Physicians are having a battle. There's a contingent of physicians who are looking at these maintenance of certification requirements, mandatory, and in order to maintain their licensure status, which your proposal and the proposal that I agree with and the proposal that we proposed clear a couple of years ago, it would do it in spades. But just like pilots have to get recertified and get recertified regularly, I see nothing wrong with the recertification regime. But what's happened is that the American College of Physicians has it's expensive, it's lengthy, and to tell you the truth, like so many of these specialty organizations, the questions they ask may not have much to do with what you're doing on a daily basis. And so
keep in mind too that any of these organizations, potentially, this is wide open for competition amongst certifying organizations. So there could be, say within medicine, there could be multiple certifying organizations for basically doing the same thing. They might call themselves something a little bit different, but you could potentially have the equivalent of nurse practitioners certified by more than one organization, and they would be competing with each other on the basis of quality, of their certified individuals. They would want to maintain that quality, and they would be competing as well for members, for people to join them as opposed to one of the other organizations. So there's that dual competition there that I think does a lot to ensure quality. And it might be that as far as this particular requirement goes, maybe it's just really not needed. But my strategy for including it is that it answers a question someone might ask: how do we know that these are truly legitimate, organizations, where after all we're letting them potentially compete with licensed, governmentally licensed individuals in the same scope of practice? And that was part of my concern for including that.
And I realize that, but I answered the question pretty much exactly the way you did. But and I said to Shirley just what you said, and I think it's a good answer. But I'm glad you included it, because I think it's going to come up. And I think, but what we have to realize, Byron, is we're kicking the can down the road a little bit. And what we're going to do, if there's going to be politicization again, it's going to be at this level. Which of the certifying organizations will a state accept? And that one may get itself a monopoly. You see what I'm saying? So,
right. Well, again, this doesn't really give the enforcing agency a lot of wiggle room on that sort of thing. Pretty much, if you show that you've met these basic requirements, they have to let you. They're just mostly a registration node, if you will. Now, if there's, they would have the right, under the way this is drafted, they would have the right to look at an organization and see, are you really legitimately meeting all of these requirements? And inevitably, I think you're right that there's going to be someone who tries to abuse whatever little bit of authority they have here, and there'll be lawsuits that'll be litigated. And in some states, they're kind of, a little shady in the way they do things. Maybe they might not come down in the right way, but some states would. And there's no way to completely tell the future on something like that.
Yeah, that's why I would look to umbrella organizations that already kind of set standards and qualifications for good certification. And
yeah, like an accreditation type thing almost.
Yeah, like there's a lot of things that the U.S. Department of Education, the Institute for Credentialing Excellence. I mean, there's a lot of resources we can look to that have already studied this, and
right.
And so we can kind of refer to those and get acquainted with those to help answer some of the objections that are sure to be raised if we can ever get this thing moving along.
That's a good point, and I appreciate the suggestion. I need to educate myself on those things. The draft itself, honestly, it is intentionally constructed in a way to leave as much flexibility as you can reasonably think is possible to get through a legislature, given the current mindset of people when it comes to licensing.
Which I think one of the big ways, having now fought in 3 or 4 different scope of practice battles, and having won one very important one last year, working with Goldwater, working with the Pew Foundation, Arizona licensed dental therapists last year, which was a big win. And a big win for the people of Arizona who can't get dental care. And I worked with the certified registered nurse anesthetists 2 years ago, and Goldwater and their organization successfully changed some wording in Arizona on the ability for CRNAs to work independent of anesthesiologists. But it is really, there's no logic or common sense when you go into a scope of practice battle. It's just dirty politics all the way through. And
Right.
and I think, you know, that idea has to be, you got to think along those lines, not logic, because logic isn't going to win the day in any state legislature.
Right.
Which is why I like CLEAR. And if anybody has an interest in licensing, I urge you to look that up on the internet and look at their website. They have published a small guidebook for legislators on how they should approach 13 questions they should ask themselves before they license a profession. And it's like it was written by Milton Friedman almost, which has surprised me. And so I think that we have allies that work in government because they're pissed at what they do and they see it being demeaned by the political process that we find so demeaning. So I think there's some natural allies that we can look to in getting some of these things done if we know where to look for them.
Yeah, and I'm encouraged by things like the report that was done by the Obama administration, which bring, you know, I mean, here you have people on the left recognizing the fact that licensing actually hurts people economically and is a contributor to the extent that you think it's really a problem, the unequal distribution of income. And so, I mean, that's something that economists have recognized for a very long time. But, you know, one of the first, I was totally shocked years ago when I was working in state government in Texas, and I knew this young lady was very liberal, and she said, "Yeah, I've looked into licensing. That's evil." And so it's not as if this is something that you don't have to be a libertarian to recognize how bad it is. It's just that people don't easily see an alternative, and that's what this is intended to do for what it is that they see as positive in licensing. And this idea, I would argue, preserves the positives that people see in licensing, but gets rid of the negatives.
Byron, Jeff, it's Charlie here. Can I ask a question?
Please.
So in past work with Byron and Murray and Lee McGrath at Institute for Justice, and by the way, Murray and Byron, Lee is in a library at the Minnesota Capitol, and he can't verbalize this question, but he did want you guys to talk more about how a certification organization gets accredited by the state. And I think you guys did go over the details and problems politically with that whole process, with the usual problem, you know, regulatory capture that Murray raised. And I know on some calls, Byron, if we recall, some friends that each of us have are in the certification business. And I just reached out to a new one, an old DC lobbyist friend. There will be lots of allies in this as the accreditors and certifiers learn about this proposal and see the upside entrepreneurially, how certification organizations can make money on this, raise their cachet, their brand, raise the quality of consumer shopping as they seek out better and better certifiers that choose their service provider. So I've met so many folks that are really interested in the growth of this issue.
It's nice to see it's kind of each end's kind of coming and meeting around back behind the barn, like we said on some of these calls in the past. It's an excellent situation for sure. I'm going to see now we can unmute. We've got about 5-10 minutes here, so let's unmute everybody real quick. Unless you got yourself muted and you have a question, please go for it.
Hey, Byron, it's James Holman at the Mackinac Center. I'm kind of curious about something that, like, we can't really know, but I want you to speculate on it anyway. If you do get these passed in some major states, how long before you think there is a thriving and efficient certification market that would provide some real benefits to citizens.
I think this is one of those things that, honestly, if you open the door, I think I would be shocked on how quickly people would jump at it. One of the problems with getting this done in the first place is that some people don't even know that they're constituents of the idea. Part of it is they don't know the idea exists, but there's also the tendency for people to realize, okay, well, this licensing exists, so I'm not even going to try in a particular area. Whereas as soon as this law exists, they're going to realize, oh my goodness, here's a real opportunity that I used to dismiss out of hand. And I think it would be very quick. I think within a few years we'd see some real critical mass build up around this.
That's good. All right, I'm see if you have another question here. We're ready for another one or two. I would say if you can raise your hand too, that'll help steer me into there so we don't have to unmute everybody all the time. Lee's got himself muted, unfortunately.
You may, Jeff, want to remind folks where that raise hand icon is. It's 2 spots below the red-green icon where you mute yourself.
Yeah, and the little control panel at the top right over there.
Yeah, someone has their phone and laptop on at the same time. That's causing the feedback.
I wasn't hearing that, but okay. All right, I have a couple more people that were muted or unmuted at the moment. Charles, did you maybe have a question you wanted to ask while we're kind of getting anybody else here to step up to the plate?
Well, I mean, we have a lot of folks on this call who like this issue, so I would ask them, blurt out your question. You've got the 2 top people in the country on this issue in the call: Murray Feldstein from Goldwater and Byron Schlomach from the
Ralph, I just unmuted you too.
All right. This has been a very interesting discussion. I've been learning and listening.
It has been pretty fascinating. It's such a long time coming. It's almost anything. It's just like we've been discovering because of the very topics we've been through. The timing is so critical because you need so many different things sort of hitting at the right moment. Just like when you talked about how those cabs collapsed, it was a variety of things that had to make that shift happen. And that's kind of where we're maybe getting a little bit to that sweet spot. What are some of the things as consumers that we can either do on an individual basis or that any of us could do with, areas where we may sit on a perch and have an audience that we can message? What are some things we can do to accelerate this idea? Either Murray or Byron, for that matter.
I'm open to ideas as much as anything else, honestly. But go ahead, Murray.
I see several. I see two major things that are happening that will push this forward, and none of it has to do with us educating the public. The public will educate itself. One, as I said before, is the concept of Uberization, and Uberization is a word in the dictionary. You can look it up. Look it up online, and I'm going to try to summarize it. I don't have it in front of me. But it's the disruption of an industry by permitting customers and suppliers of services to contact each other individually over electronically and transact electronically. Each one can do it independent of anything else. And so that's what Uber was. That was the prototype. And so the result was so overwhelmingly favorably received by the public. I mean, I can remember, I don't live in New York. I don't want to live in New York, but I got lots of family that lives in New York. And I can remember waiting on the curb in the rain for a taxi cab and getting shoved out of the way when somebody else, once I had the door open, pushed me out of the way to get in. That doesn't happen anymore. Now instead of you competing for taxis, Uber drivers are competing for you. And just take it right to where a doctor's office is. You don't have to wait if you're on Teladoc or one of the other Uber-like medical organizations. It's just like Uber. The price is transparent, the service is immediate, and for certain things, it's just as good or better than going to a doctor's office. If once the public sees that, it's going to make your work easy because it's going to just force it to happen. So I see that as one major vector, one major force that's going to move this forward. The second is that we are increasing scopes of practice little bit by little bit, gradually by gradually in states. It's dental therapists here, it's nurse practitioners being able to write a prescription here, it's CVS's minute clinics over there, and people are getting used to the idea of getting quicker service, not through the traditional methods. And so I hear a vacuum cleaner or something.
Do you hear? I don't hear anything here.
Yeah. So
everybody's muted.
So that the nurse practitioners themselves will get more political power, and it'll get easier and easier to increase scopes of practice just by the virtue of the number of people who are going to have a voice. And the danger is that once they get that scope of practice, they'll co-opt with the medical profession and join forces to keep other people out. That is a problem, and it's proven by what the osteopaths did once they got accepted into the medical profession. They now join forces regularly with the very same people who try to keep them out in order to keep other people out.
Always the runaway issue on that particular one. Well, it's an interesting note to leave it on, because that's the part we'll have to figure out if we hopefully have that problem as our issue. I want to thank you for coming today. Everybody was great, and this was a fantastic talk. We could just keep on going, and we definitely want to get some follow-up, as we will on some of the other ones we've been discussing in these past episodes, as it were. And I will be posting this. We're going to have the link to it, so if you had missed the call, we'll send it out so you'll be able to catch it. And for those who want to review it or share it, we'll have that as well. So, gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for being here today. And Charles, if you'd like to close us out with a reminder, who do we have again next week?
Next week, we go to a big issue with a long history, mutual aid. How can we bring it back? It's kind of like the Uberization we're talking about.
But the same sort of dynamics that you're describing on this issue. So, yeah, it's interesting. Everything's converging at once. We're at an interesting time. Well, everyone, thanks very much, and I will see you in a week.
Byron.